Afternoon. My name is Alan Elsner. I'm a senior advisor at J Street. I'm welcoming you to this call with Danny Seidemann, and the subject is the latest developments in Jerusalem, the new settlements, the attempt to shift the borders of the city. Let me welcome you all. Danny Seidemann, as well as being a very good friend of J Street, is the leading Israeli expert on Jerusalem in a geopolitical context, the founder of Terrestrial Jerusalem, an Israeli NGO that delivers information, maps and data about Jerusalem-related developments which could impact the political process of permanent status options. Since 1994, he's participated in many of the Track 2 talks between Israelis and Palestinians dealing with Jerusalem. I guess that for the rest of his bio, which is long and distinguished, we should be able to find you a link. Welcome, Danny. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Let's start by going back a little bit. Perhaps you could explain to us how the municipal borders of Jerusalem, as they are today, got to be the way they are.
The short answer is by accident. In 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, but we did not anticipate a war with Jordan. We did not expect the war. We did not initiate it. We were unprepared for it militarily, and we were unprepared for its consequences. And so much so that on the second day of the war, Moshe Dayan stood atop one of the buildings on Mount Scopus, looked over the old city and said, "Who the hell needs these Vaticans?" The next day, Dayan appeared with Israeli paratroopers on the Temple Mount and said, "The Jewish people have returned to our sacred sites, never to take leave of them again. What a difference a day makes." 2 weeks after the war, Israel did something that we did not do in the West Bank. We annexed the area of East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem under Jordan was tiny. It was 6.5 square kilometers, 5 square miles. We annexed much more than that. We annexed some 27 and 28 Palestinian villages. We did it by administrative fiat. It was not brought before the Knesset. There was legislation that empowered the government and the Minister of Interior to expand the borders of Israel and to incorporate areas into the Jerusalem municipality, and that is what was done. The rationale in back of it was a classic labor movement rationale: as much land as possible and as few Palestinians. Prior to the war in 1967, Jerusalem was 2 cities, an Israeli city in West Jerusalem and a Palestinian city under Jordanian occupation. Overnight, on the 28th of June, 1967, Jerusalem was transformed into a binational city.
Okay, so that explains how Jerusalem got the borders, which have not been internationally recognized, that it has. But the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem did not become citizens of Israel. What is their status today?
It's an excellent question, because Israel in 1967 annexed the land of East Jerusalem. We did not annex the people. We did not impose our citizenship as we had done in 1948 and 1949 with the Palestinian citizens of Israel. By the way, that's not an accusation. We could not have done it. We couldn't have gotten away with it. We didn't offer citizenship, and the Palestinians didn't want citizenship. You will be told by our accomplished Hasbaristas, including the formal website of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that the Palestinians of East Jerusalem are entitled to receive citizenship. Urban legend, not correct. They can ask, we can say no. They don't ask, and we say no. Since 1967, out of the 700,000 or 800,000 Palestinians who have lived in the city, approximately 14,000 had requested citizenship, 5,500 had received it, and in the last year, something like 50 or 60 did get Israeli citizenship. What is their status? They're permanent residents, which means that they have some of the entitlements of Israeli citizenship. They have Social Security benefits. They have the national insurance, which actually functions very well. They are permanently politically disempowered. They do not have an Israeli passport. They do not vote in national elections. They cannot be elected to the Knesset. They can vote for mayor, but they cannot become mayor. Now, the Palestinians of East Jerusalem are, as residents, entitled to vote in the municipal elections. They don't do so because to do so would be to acquiesce to the legitimacy of Israeli rule. In the last elections, there were more than 157,000 eligible Palestinian voters. Of them, 1,101 cast a ballot. That is a 0.7% voter turnout. And our illustrious mayor walks around and says, everybody, Jews, Christians and Muslims, Israeli and Palestinians, elected me as mayor. Well, he got 561 votes out of 157,000. That is the myth of this united Jerusalem.
Now, the fact that the Palestinians are not represented in the municipality, that nobody is looking out for their interests, has meant that their neighborhoods have basically become neglected. Can you describe the state of some of the major Palestinian neighborhoods?
The hard data is very difficult to get to, but the best estimates are that between 10 and 12% of the municipal and governmental budgets directed at Jerusalem go to the Palestinian sector, who are 37 or 38% of the population, which is an indication that the investment in the Israeli resident is several times larger than it is in the Palestinian resident. By the way, I think that this is inevitable because there is an ironclad law of politics. Politicians will never allocate resources to people who cannot or won't vote. Not time, not money, not entitlements, etc. It's inherently unsustainable. This means, for example, that since 1967, Israel has built 55,000 residential units in East Jerusalem. Well, that's great. All of them for Israeli. We have built less than 600 residential units for Palestinians since 67. The last of that was in the 1970s. All of this is geared to accelerate the development of the Israeli sector and put an artificial cap on the development of the Palestinian sector. The birth of a Jewish child in Jerusalem is a simcha. The birth of a Palestinian child is a demographic problem. As a result of that, we have artificially created circumstances where it's virtually impossible for Palestinians to build legally in East Jerusalem, based on the curious theory that if we do not allow the Palestinians to build legally, they will lose interest in sex and childbearing and take up chess. That has not been borne out by the empirical evidence.
I would like to just state for the record that it is possible to play chess and be interested in childbearing.
Multitasking.
I will. I want to move on to what's been happening recently, and I want to invite anyone that our viewers to send questions if you have them to info@jstreet.org, and we'll try to get us to as many of them as possible. But just one last background question before we get to the recent developments. During the Second Intifada, a decision was taken to build a security wall which passes through Jerusalem. Can you explain, because I think this is pertinent to what the Israeli government is trying to do, where that wall passes, how many Palestinians are included in it, how many are excluded beyond it, and how many Israeli settlements that are not currently in the Jerusalem municipality would be there for within the western side of the wall, the Israeli side, so to speak?
There is a quip in Hebrew that a camel is a horse planned by a committee. And the wall in the Jerusalem area is a bit like that because there were three underlying concepts. Much of the wall was on the municipal boundary, which sounds reasonable, but the municipal boundary includes East Jerusalem. So almost invariably, the wall or the fence in Jerusalem separates Palestinian from Palestinian and not Israeli from Palestinian. The second concept was the Greater Jerusalem concept, where we delineated a certain concept of what the settlement blocks are. And this could only be described as something of a land grab, where there are large bubbles extending beyond Jerusalem to the north in Givat Ze'ev, to the east in Ma'ale Adumim, and in the south to the Etzion block, where there are hundreds of thousands of settlers. This is gerrymandering the wall in order to achieve territorial ambitions. Israel denied it at the time, saying this is not political, it's limited tactical. I think that at this point, even official Israel concedes that is not exactly the case. The third, and this is what you're most interested in, was the demographic wall. Israel, as I mentioned, has done everything to accelerate the development of the Israeli sector, and we have failed. We have failed because in 1967, the Palestinian sector was about 25 or 26% of the population. Today it's 38, 39, or 40%. Part of that, we tried to address part of that by gerrymandering the wall so that it extends deep inside the city in two specific areas. One is on the eastern flank of the city, the Shuafat refugee camp, the one refugee camp in Jerusalem in the village of Anata. And the second is on the border with Ramallah to the north of the Kalandia Atarot airport, Kafar Akim. The population figures are notoriously inaccurate here, but the best estimates are that there are between 50 and 60,000 people in each of these areas, a total of approximately 100 to 120,000. That's about 30 to 33% of the population of Jerusalem, of Palestinian Jerusalem. Okay. And they are people who are living inside the municipal limits. They are formally part of Israel, physically cut off from Jerusalem. Jerusalem remains accessible to them by going through a checkpoint. They can move to Tel Aviv or Jaffa or West Jerusalem. They don't, but they could. But they have been physically excised from the city. Now, this relates to your previous question. To a certain extent, the provision of services in East Jerusalem has always reminded me of the gangrene effect. The Israeli heart is incapable of generating the blood pressure necessary to bring vital blood supply to the extremities. And the further out you go in East Jerusalem, the lower the already meager level of services become. When you get to the wall and cross over the wall, those services are not meager, they totally collapse. There is zero or virtually zero Israeli presence there, with the exception of the border police and Israeli military presence. There are a few exceptions. There are subcontractors that occasionally will pick up the trash. There are some funding for schools, but basically Israel's presence there is fictitious. If you today were to stand, as I do in French Hill, and look out over the Shuafat refugee camp, it looks like downtown Ramallah. It doesn't look like a refugee camp. There are high-rises, and they look exactly like the high-rises in Ramallah, except for one thing. The high-rises in Ramallah will stand in the approaching earthquake, and we live in an earthquake zone because there have been building inspectors. In the absence of any governments, those buildings in the Shuafat refugee camp will collapse, and there will be thousands of casualties because we are in a governance void. That is the situation beyond the barrier in the undivided capital of Israel.
Now let's move to the latest developments. And obviously, the Israelis started building settlements in East Jerusalem immediately after 1967. Ramat Eshkol, I believe, was the first, and then French Hill, which you mentioned, Ramat and East Talpiot and Gilo, and many, many others. And we're all used to constant announcement of new building permits being issued for different settlements. What makes this latest move, which would have been, which would have adjusted the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem that we already discussed? What made that different?
First of all, we have to understand what this proposal was, and in many ways still is. It has been deferred, although components of it are still proceeding, and I assume that this will be back sooner rather than later. The first component is to erase the green line, not only in East Jerusalem, but deep into the West Bank. And in the government that was brought, in the proposal that was brought before the cabinet, the settlements that are in the settlement blocks as designated by the barrier and beyond the barrier, including places like the Koa, would be integrated in some way or another, not entirely clear, into the Jerusalem municipality, which would be a major step in the direction of a de facto annexation of hundreds of thousands of settlers living in occupied territory, not as defined by the world alone, but by Israel as well. Now, this isn't the first time that it happened. Netanyahu tried to do precisely this in June of 1998, and certain unnamed people were able to get wind of this, and it was a different administration in Washington, and President Clinton came down like a ton of bricks on this, and Netanyahu backed down. We are now witnessing Netanyahu 2.0. He is increasingly defiant. He is increasingly imperial. It is back, and there's a different administration in Washington. That is only 50% of this initiative, perhaps even a third, because there's a third component which has not received enough attention. The second component is to take the areas which you just mentioned, the 120,000 individuals who are living in Kafr Aqab, and in the Shuafat refugee camp, and to excise them from Jerusalem. They will no longer be in Jerusalem. They will still be Israel. We are not transferring authority to the PA. This is not a territorial concession. This is turning them into an autonomous sub-municipality or an independent municipality. There are different variations on this. Well, that sounds great. Isn't it wonderful? We're giving them autonomy and independence in Israel. You will then have 120,000 people living in their own municipality, none of whom have the right to vote, none of whom have citizenship, none of whom are politically empowered, in an area that is devoid of resources, no sources of employment, no connection to the central government. I generally bristle with over simplistic comparisons between Israel and apartheid, but what I have described is a Bantustan. I can't think of anything else. Now, this is gerrymandering in a blatantly binational situation. In a 20-mile radius of the Temple Mount, there are 800,000 Palestinians and 800,000 Israelis. And we are drawing squiggly lines on a map in order to force ourselves deeper into an already existing state of denial. Hey, we have reduced the number of Palestinians by 120,000. We've raised the number of Israelis by 150,000. Jerusalem's not 40% Palestinian, it's 20% Palestinian. Not one Israeli or not one Palestinian's moved. The reality is the same, and we are deluding ourselves into thinking by creating this bifurcated geopolitical reality, we're solving problems. No, what we are doing is creating one geographical space in which there are different concentrations of people with different nationalities, with different sets of rights, and that narrows the comfort zone between Israel and the apartheid regime very dangerously.
And what are the implications for a possible two-state solution if you should ever have leaders that were willing to negotiate?
What we are seeing is not isolated. Since July, I believe Jerusalem and the conflict has entered uncharted and dangerous waters. Netanyahu, after years of relative restraint with no new tenders in Jerusalem, no new plans, opened up the floodgates. And we saw in a few short days something like 1,300 units approved in East Jerusalem. We have seen game-changing plans in existing Palestinian neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah. We've seen this legislative initiative. We've seen 3,000 units in the West Bank. We've seen massive infrastructures, such as the opening of the Gilo interchange. You can now go to Tel Aviv to the Etzion block without a traffic light, seamlessly integrating the settlements into Israel proper, further blurring the distinction between the West Bank and Israel. We see an uptick of displacement, whether it's the Shamasna family in Sheikh Jarrah or the very vulnerable Bedouin, in Khan al-Ahmar, and in Susia. They're getting in the way. What we are witnessing is Netanyahu unshackled. He always would only do what the traffic will bear, and he now believes that the traffic will bear a resolute move towards de facto annexation of Area C. That is not about to happen. That is already happening. The level of engagement from Washington is much lower. It is not adversarial. Europe is fragmented. There are some minor tsuris in places like Korea, Crimea, Brexit, Catalonia. Netanyahu is acting as if he can get away with this, and the world is proving him right.
But that proposal, which was supposed to come to the cabinet a couple of weeks ago, was abruptly taken off the agenda. And one reads that that was because of the intervention of the Trump administration. What do you know about that? And when do you expect it to come back onto the agenda?
Well, first of all, I don't, and I was sort of hoping you would be able to enlighten me. There have been two incidents where we have pulled back from the brink. One an American, one an Israeli. One was the decision, in the meantime, not to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I understand there were hearings today on the Hill on that. It's not over. And that was supposed to happen on the first day of the Trump administration. It didn't happen. And this was pulled. One can only conjecture. It is my understanding, and this is completely unsubstantiated, that some of the Sunni states, particularly Jordan on the issue of the embassy and the Saudis on this issue, have an open door to certain places in the Trump administration. It's my experience that this administration is not completely disengaged. It's a different kind of engagement. Basically, they will not tell Netanyahu, don't do this. Netanyahu said to the settlers recently, we have to take their position into consideration. What I don't do today, I'll do 2 months or 3 months from now. It's my interpretation, this is without any direct knowledge, that the administration knows in advance what Netanyahu is doing, and they're telling him, give us a break, lay off this. The Saudis are getting antsy. Wait a while, wait for an opportune moment. And Netanyahu is rather accommodating. But these are tactical suspensions. And even now, there is an additional initiative led by Zev Elkin, which isolates one of the components of this legislation, cutting off the Palestinian areas, which enjoys the support, and that may proceed without the formal annexation. In addition, there is an additional law before the Knesset, which would be an amendment to a basic law, which would require 81 fingers in the Knesset out of 120, and a majority in a referendum in order to change the borders of Jerusalem. Now, you may recall earlier I mentioned that Jerusalem was annexed without any approval by the Knesset, and if this law passes, future majorities in Israel will be incapable of undoing that step. Now, the existing situation does require a special majority or a majority in a referendum. What this means is that 80% of the Israeli public will vote in favor of a permanent status agreement with two capitals, and it won't succeed because you can't get the 81 fingers in the Knesset. This is another strategic thrust to prevent the creation of a viable and contiguous Palestinian state. It's not a conspiracy, it's parts of a puzzle. And the parts are not accidental, they're part of a coherent, rational thrust, one which I consider undermines the most fundamental national interests of Israel and the Zionist enterprise.
I have an interesting question from Toby Citron in Michigan. What has been the impact of the light rail system on stated attempts to unify Jerusalem? Has it helped, hindered, or had no appreciable effect?
God bless you, it's a wonderful question, okay? Until July of 2014, our Hasbaristas were on steroids. Go into the light rail, and on every car of the light rail, their capacity is about 190 people. And they say, look at this incredible coexistence. You have got the Orthodox woman with the tichel, you've got the gun-toting settler, you've got the Franciscan monk, you've got the Qadi, you know, and shucks, kumbaya, off into the sunset, and we're all getting along fine. Now that was always a bit of a hollow image, but you would see that composition. That changed overnight in July of 2014. Unfortunately, Muhammad Abu Khdeir, the Palestinian youth, was murdered right next to the light rail, and it became a symbol of Israeli occupation. And for months on end, the light rail was pummeled with rocks and torched. Rarely happens still, but something else happened. You get on the light rail today. In the past, you would see Palestinians going from Beit Hanina and Shuafat to the old city on the light rail and going home. They're boycotting. They haven't gone back. When they have to, they'll go to West Jerusalem because they don't have any alternative. What is happening here is a quiet boycott. They basically are saying, you have turned us into domesticated extras into your hollow extravaganza of a united Jerusalem. We're not playing the role that your central casting is. Coexistence? Nonsense. So today you will see in large parts of the light rail, which serve the Palestinian population, get onto the train, you will find Israelis and 1 or 2 Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you, because this is rather kind of a doom-laden prognosis that you're giving, and we are, an activist advocacy organization. Is there anything does J Street have a role in trying to, maybe through its endorsees on Capitol Hill or its place in the community, can we make a difference in this in this debate, in the Prime Minister's calculations of the political cost, the political price that he might have to pay for this annexation should he go through with it?
A role important as never before. And I think possible, without underestimating the difficulties, in new ways. What we're seeing globally, domestic politics in the United States, Europe, and in Israel, in this wave of rather authoritarian results in elections, are the collapse of the value of facts, the collapse of the value of norms, and the facts of the value of accountability. And that's dangerous to the civil societies and the well-being of all of us. And what is called upon of those of us who are concerned, as we are, about the long-term viability of Israel, is to be the keepers of the flame. The facts do matter. The norms do matter. Decency, Menschlichkeit matters. Accountability matters. And we are not alone. I mean, look, I know that Europe is fragmented. Netanyahu has succeeded in creating an obstructionist bloc in Europe, and the former Soviet bloc, the Czechs and the Poles, and the gas mafia. But we have friends in the Elysee and the Quai d'Orsay. We have friends in the Chancellor's office, and they're worried and they're concerned and they're allies. Netanyahu's embrace of the Trump administration, and more importantly, the people around Trump, and some of those who are associated with him, the past that is sometimes giving to anti-Semitism, the breach with a diaspora jury, are creating new fault lines. I am discovering that American Jews are listening to issues concerning the perils of occupation as never before, and when I find them listening, I find J Street. It is also possible, the last election showed, that you can engage Israel critically, not Israel bashing, critically, with little political effect. It is not politically suicidal. It happened on Iran. It also happened on Israel-Palestine issues. I think today there is the potential of changing the discourse in the American political system, in the Democratic Party, because people are becoming more aware of just how toxic and dangerous these new winds of totalitarianism and authoritarianism are. We have an historic role. We are beleaguered as never before. I mean, in Israel, you know, I look at the American society in some ways with envy. There are so many millions of people in different ways who are challenging some of the things that are coming out of the Trump administration. What millions are doing in the United States, there are hundreds of us in Israel, but we're keepers of the flame, and you are our allies, and it is possible. You know, the situation is bleak, but there are new opportunities. We have to take every crack and a sledgehammer and bang away at them.
I wanted to ask you to put yourself in the shoes, I know this is not an easy thing to do, of Ron Dermer, who's the Israeli ambassador here in Washington, and has observed what happened in the elections we had here yesterday, which was a fairly massive repudiation of Trump and Democratic comeback. And of course, we have much more important elections 1 year from now in which the whole of the Congress will be at stake. Do you think there's any thought going on in Israeli policy circles around Netanyahu that A, they might want to make a dash for it now while they still have the Republicans, or B, that they should take account of the fact that maybe the Republicans, their buddies, won't be in control of everything forever, and they'll have to be dealing with other people, and it behooves them not to alienate those people? Which do you think is more likely, or is it all kind of irrelevant? And
I think that we've seen Netanyahu 2.0 from his election a couple of years ago, preceding Trump. And he has become increasingly imperial and defiant and unshackled. It is clear that with President Obama no longer in office and President Trump in office, the deterrent effect is much lower. There are many Israelis who consider the unabashed alignment of Israel with the Republican Party and a certain wing of the Republican Party to be a strategic threat to Israel. I happen to go along with that. I believe that. I do not see Netanyahu. I think that one of the most important components of Netanyahu's genuine neshama, his soul, he is a Republican more than he's a Likudnik. And I don't see that changing. But I do see many Americans re-examining the impact of that, and certainly Israelis re-examining the impact. It's not good for the Jews.
Can you talk about we've been talking about J Street and the Democrats here. What about the Israeli left and any kind of organized opposition to this creeping annexation or virtual annexation that you described?
The answer is very little. The one reason that I'm delighted that Zahava Gal'on resigned from the Knesset, that she was replaced by Mossi Raz, who is the first member of this Knesset who will be holding the banner of ending occupation high. There are those who agree with us, by all means. But those where it's burning in their bones who will lead this, there's been nobody in this Knesset. There's nobody in the organized political community that is really articulating the concerns that we are. Exception, Ehud Barak. Whatever one thinks of Ehud Barak, and I have my criticism, he is clearly pushing back against Netanyahu on this, and he's doing so successfully. He's drawing blood. We also have some of the generals, many of the generals. We, as Israel, as Netanyahu morphs into 50 shades of authoritarianism, you're seeing pushback from the hidden elites of captains of industry and in the arts and culture, etc. This has not crystallized into an organized political opposition. I don't think it will likely happen as long as Netanyahu is around and there is no prospect of forward movement. If there will be an Israeli prime minister, and I'm not talking about a prime minister from the left, from the pragmatic right, who is concerned about these issues, I believe you will very rapidly see a regeneration of the forces of moderation in Israel. It's there, it's dormant, but we should not underestimate just how beleaguered we are at the moment.
One theory that I've heard is that Netanyahu feels the threat of the various scandals that he is involved in becoming greater to the continuation of his tenure in office, and therefore is moving faster on the settlement issue to consolidate his base around him, so that even if he were indicted, he might not have to resign and could stay in office. What's your reaction to that?
I agree with that totally, with one small exception. I don't think it's really happened yet. I think what we're seeing is the situation before he has found it necessary to consolidate the base. I just spoke with one of your staff here in New York about the prospects of an approval of E1. Every American president until Trump, every national leader in Europe has told Israel, you're not going to build E1. And every Israeli prime minister has said, no, we don't get that. We're cool with that. We're not going to build it. And that includes Netanyahu. If it will be necessary to appease Bayit Yehudi and Naftali Bennett by approving E1 in order to remain in office after an indictment, I believe Netanyahu will not bat an eyelash and he will approve E1.
Wow, that's quite a statement, Danny. So
I hope we do not have the opportunity of finding out.
So the conclusion one draws from that is that Netanyahu really doesn't think about the strategic impact of what he's doing for the state of Israel, the long-term effects for its international standing. What he thinks of is just staying in power. It's as simple as that.
I disagree.
Okay.
I think that Netanyahu, and this is something that I came late to, I think that Netanyahu is indeed a strategist. When he stands on top of Mount Scopus, where I always stand with your groups, and looks out over the Jordan River Valley, he says to himself, the world's a dangerous place for everybody. It's doubly and triply dangerous for Jews, and I'm responsible for the Jews. And there's only one people that is entitled and empowered to the west of the Jordan River, and that is the Jewish people. Regrettably, there are 6 million Palestinians to the west of the Jordan River, and we have to accommodate them. We cannot be their permanent occupiers. We will make the minimum territorial concessions, areas A and areas B. We'll call it a state and engage in the de facto annexation of Area C. We'll never get an agreement because we don't need an agreement. I don't want an agreement. I don't expect an agreement. I'm a Hobbesian. Life is about eternal struggle. Our goal is not an agreement, but to consolidate this goal of Israeli hegemony over the West Bank, less areas A and areas B. And our goal is to bring the world to acquiesce and to the Palestinians to submit. And that is his strategic goal. It is not all tactics. He's a masterful technician. He knows how to put his, use the throttle well. That's his goal. Hasn't changed.
What is his understanding? You referred a couple of times to the imperial prime ministership. And what is his understanding of what democracy means? And what are the rights of the minority or those who are not in power in his mind? Do they have the right to criticize? Do they have the right to free speech? Or what should they do in his mind?
Authoritarian soft. If you look at a number of incidents internationally and domestically, they have a common denominator. There's the gratuitous fight that he picked with the German foreign minister of meeting, breaking the silence and boycotting him. A Jew boycotting a German foreign minister because he met with an Israeli citizen who, oh my goodness, trumped up charges of anti-Semitism against UNESCO. I'm not a fan of UNESCO, but their decisions were not anti-Semitic. You have the gratuitous fights with others in Europe, Sweden, etc. And then you have the assault on the pillars of Israeli democracy. That includes the courts. But it also includes civil society. It's not an accident that B'Tselem and New Israel Fund in breaking the silence. Netanyahu is trying to bully the world, our allies, and bully civil society and Israel into clinical occupation denial. And there's not enough pushback. And J Street is one of the few organizations that's pushing back with some success.
Well, Danny, I want to thank you for educating us and teaching us again. I think it's been fascinating. I want to thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for your friendship for J Street, and I want to pledge on behalf of the organization that we will redouble our efforts. We are looking ahead with new optimism to 2018. We think it's going to be better than 2017. And we will be there for you, just as you will be there for us. So thank you so much.
One final word. The skeptics are always right until they're wrong. Someday they're going to be wrong, and we're going to be there.
It's said that the gift of prophecy was taken away from the Jewish people after the age of the prophets and given to fools and children. So on that note, thank you so much, and goodbye from Washington.
Bye-bye.